I have a deep admiration for people who don't get a whole lot of respect. They don't get talked about enough. I really respect the French people, and I respect them for a good reason. They are the most bloody and violent protesters ever. They just, you could be a small politician and you put a stop sign in the wrong neighborhood, someone's going to shit on your doorstep. That's just the way the French are. I've got like a little list here of all of the craziest stuff the French have protested or like just fights they've gone into, and I wanted to go over it a little bit here. The French get a lot of hate for being rude or surrender monkeys. I want to talk about how brutal the French people are, how violent they are, and how fucking good they are at doing a protest or a riot or something. The most annoying hate that I hear French people get is like surrender monkeys. They surrender in wars and stuff. Like the only like that's bullshit. The main time that they surrendered was in Germany, like when Germany invaded. You would have surrendered too, man. The Germans were on meth and they invaded in like a day. Germans on meth? That's like the scariest group of people to be on meth. They're already so efficient and now they're on meth. Like, come on. This is like, there's like 10 things listed here just for the 1200s alone. You know, like the revolt of Marseille, the revolt in Legume, the tax revolt in Cahors, revolt in Rouen, tax revolt in Rouen. All right, so let's talk about the French protests. All right, first on the list, we got the University of Paris strike, which was basically just like these students who forgot to pay their tab at the bar or would like got into an argument with the bartender and they like got beat up. So they went back and beat him up. So like the 12th century, right? Basically, the strike occurred as a disagreement over an unpaid tab at a local tavern, and it got like the death of several students. So this is the 1200s, 1229, right? So medieval times. So it was a Tuesday in March of 1229, and there was a pre-Lenten carnival, which is like medieval Mardi Gras for the French people, right? So a bunch of students went to a tavern drinking wine, right? They argued with the owner of the bar about paying the bill. Doesn't matter, drunk people arguing, right? They get beat up by the bartender and like his friends and stuff. So they come back with like a whole mob of students, beat up the bartender and destroy his bar. Like other shops were destroyed. The riots spilled onto the street. And basically these students had a benefit of clergy, which like because they were like went to the university, they were like studying religion, they were completely exempt and like just had like no consequences at all. Basically the city guards, the university had to let the city guards come in and like arrest the students, rough them up, but the city guards didn't. They just came in and killed a bunch of students. They just fucking killed them. They didn't even get the right guys. They got the wrong students. They just killed students who didn't have anything to do with the riots. The response from the university was obviously, a big strike, and this went on for 2 years, right? This was like 2 years. This is the Queen Blanc and Pope Gregory are like hashing it out for 2 years. The they figured it out the way they worked this out. The deal they made was the Pope was like they got the university honoring the mother of scientists. The Magna Carta is what it was called, and the university was totally guaranteed independence from local authorities. And basically, until like a long time later, they just called it devil's work. The whole riots were just devils. The devil did it. Devil did it, buddy. You know, j'aime la femme garçon. And then in the 1350s, you had the Jacquerie, which was basically just a bunch of peasants being like told by tax collectors and stuff like that to revolt against the nobility because they thought that the nobles had abandoned the king who was captured in the Hundred Years' War by the English. And they just kind of, started attacking, going from village to village, attacking nobles and stuff, like looting, pillaging, stuff like that. During this uprising, the peasants basically destroyed like 150 noble houses in like Paris and surrounding areas, and just completely destroyed, killed everybody in the house. And Jean Lebel, he's basically the guy who recorded all of this, says that apparently when they were asked like, why are you doing this? They just kind of said, well, we saw everybody else doing it, so we just sort of joined in, which is perfectly French, perfect for French violence, I think. You just saw them doing it, so they jumped in and did it. Je dois habiter en France ou Québec, Montréal, l'Amazon dans Québec, c'est ne sais pas. Coûte, coûte ne sais pas. Je te dis mon français beaucoup avec Duolingo. Oui, oui. Oui, oui, baguette. And this is the French, so shit doesn't get better in the 14th century, right? Like Revolt in Paris, the Crusades of the Poor, the Shepherd's Crusade, the Jacques Curie Peasant Revolt. So the Crusade of the Poor, which was basically just all these North French, a little bit of English, a little bit of German, poor dudes, like really poor guys, who all wanted to go join a crusade that was about to happen, you know, against Jerusalem or the Holy Lands and stuff like that. But they never actually made it to the crusade. They never got to join because they just kind of walked there and argued with people, argued with the local authorities, attacked Jews, stuff like that on the way, and they never actually made it to join the crusade. They just kind of started walking there and got into fights along the way and ended up going home at the end. And this was basically the first like popular like support for crusading in like 20 years. The kingdom of Jerusalem fell to the Islamic Mamluks like almost 20 years ago, and this was the first time that this was like a thing again. Crusading was becoming a cool thing again. They started calling themselves the Brothers of the Cross, and they needed to get to Avignon, which was where the crusade was going to start, right? So, but they were all too poor to get there, so they had to rely on like charity, begging, robbery, like all this stuff to get there. And when they did eventually get there, the Pope Clement basically just sent them home. They just went home after that.
Sacre bleu! Mon baguette, mon cigarette. Sacre bleu!
In the 15th century, you have a whole bunch of stuff going on with nobles. You have the Praguerie, the League of the Public Weal, the Mad War, which is all of them are basically nobles coming together and saying fuck you to King Charles VII, fuck you to King Louis the 11th, and fuck you to King Charles VIII. Basically just trying to fight back against centralized monarchy power and have a little more power for the little guys, the little nobles. You had the riot in Nimes, you had the riot in Carcassonne, you had the riot in Nevers, the tax revolt in Agen, the riot in Lavelle, the riot in Libourne. There was a peasant revolt in Le Triomphe and Villa, the grain riots in Aix, I don't know how to pronounce that, Marseille and Tarascon, revolt in Meaux, revolt in Beauvais. The Marinadal massacre, which was basically when King Francis I ordered this entire town of Marinadal to be just totally killed, like punished. Papal soldiers came in and just murdered basically everybody for heresy, right? There was the Massacre de la Saint Bartholomew, which was like a targeted assassination and Catholic mob violence against the Protestants in the area because King Charles the Ninth's sister got married to a Protestant, so it was just all the Catholics killing all the Protestant nobility in like one day right after the wedding. The massacre lasted like several weeks, and it was something like 5,000, 3,000 people were killed during this time. Not too far later in the 17th century, the Protestants got a little bit of get back with the Huguenot Rebellion, right? Which was, just like a series of revolts in South France. So after the death of Henry IV, who was a Protestant but then became Catholic, right? He had protected the Protestants, the Huguenots, but then Louis the 13th came into power and he was like, no, he hated Protestants. So, the Huguenots, the Protestants, they basically had to create their own government, their own military, and started fighting back during this time. This is also around the time of the religious wars, and the Croquant rebellion started popping up. The Croquant rebellions were basically just peasants basically getting sick of taking care of soldiers and being beaten up by soldiers who were constantly coming and going from battling in, the Spanish, battling the in Flanders and stuff like that. These soldiers were basically, the peasants, they had to pay for them, they had to pay taxes to keep the soldiers fighting, they had to feed them, stuff like that. And the Croquant rebellions popped up around this time in the early to mid 1600s and kind of spread even into the, later on. All I'm saying is that if it was the French who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, this would probably be Trump's third consecutive term. Now, late 18th century, we get the real famous stuff, the French Revolution, cutting off all the monarchs' heads. Napoleon forms his little dictatorship. This is where it really starts to get good for French violence. And aside from that, pretty much everything from the late 17th century to the early 19th century can just be summarized as food riots. People were starving. People were hungry. It was food riots. Every year, every couple of years, riots about food. People were hungry. I mean, fuck, no wonder they had a revolution. Look, you look out like 100 years of food riots going on. I don't think they could have been surprised. 100 years of food riots and there's a revolution. I probably could have seen that one coming, but most notably of the food riots was the Flour Wars, which was basically when bread prices skyrocketed and people were, attacking the military, they were attacking the king, they were just rioting, attacking everybody because bread was too expensive, which makes sense. Imagine if we did that for eggs today, since eggs are so expensive apparently.
Je mange une orange pour le petit déjeuner. Delicioso. In the early 1900s, there was just a whole bunch of strikes, striking here, striking there. A lot of it revolving around wine and champagne. The winemakers and the champagne makers were not having a good time. They were, rioting. And if the French people don't have their wine, violence is going to get just way worse. And it did, the lack of wine and champagne. We got the Champagne riots of 1910, 1911. Basically, there was this town that made a lot of champagne, and everybody came there, and there wasn't enough real champagne. Everything was being made with grapes from outside France, or, it wasn't really champagne, it was sparkling wine or something. So all the townspeople came, fucking wrecked it, dumped trucks of grapes and trucks of champagne into the river. Don't mess with a French person's champagne, Mon champagne. You have more political dissent in 1926. You got Bloody Sunday, which was basically a bunch of nationalists versus a bunch of autonomists just clashing, ended up killing a bunch of each other, typical stuff, really. Then, a little bit later on down the road, after the war, this is after the war, after the Nazis are gone, you have the 1947 strikes and the May crisis, which was basically when all the workers striked because communist politicians were being kicked out of the government. They were, the French Communist Party was totally kicked out, and you had something like 3 million, in 1947, you had something like 3 million workers just on strike, which added up to around 23 something million days. Each of them working a day, 23 million days, where there was just no work happening. So what is that? It's a couple weeks, right? It's a couple weeks. And, I guess you don't kick out the communists, eh? A little bit down the road, we have an interesting one called the rodeo, which was a technique of rioting that became popular in France, where they would steal cars Steal cars. Around 250 cars were stolen. So basically, these are the Kia boys of 1980s France, just stealing cars from wealthy neighborhoods and just driving them around and burning them. Good stuff. Yeah, so the closer we get to modern day, we're now in the 1990s. It looks like a lot of these are way better documented. We have better record of some smaller scale stuff. A lot of these are, basically, we got young man of Spanish origin killed in motorbike crash caused by police. Rioting of Monte la Jolie after a policewoman and an Algerian man were killed. Following the death of Mohamed Bari Valo de Valin at the hands of police. Youths attacked the town's police station. Stuff like that. You get the picture. The most notable of these police death protests was the 2005 French riots, which were when, these kids were getting chased by the cops. A couple of them hid in power substation, like distribution stations. I guess they fried. They were hiding. Probably climbed onto a live bus bar, split the phase, arc flashed their guts all over the wall, and yeah, everyone was not happy about that. Pretty controversial one there. Then you have the university strikes that lasted 2 years, 2007 to 2009. Basically, the French introduced this LRU law, which was like, instead of funding programs in universities directly, they just paid the universities a lump sum and were like, bring your universities up to more, Western values, Anglo-Saxon, European standards, and it gave the deans, the chancellors of these universities a lot more freedom to do with the money what they wanted. So the students didn't really like that, But moving on, we got the yellow vests. The yellow vests, these guys like cheap fuel. They don't want to be spending too much on fuel and stuff. These guys are really all about their cars. These guys are pretty cool. In 2019, France lowered the speed limit. So the yellow vests, what they did is they just went around smashing speed cameras. They smashed something like 3,200 speed cameras, like 60% of the country's speed cameras. And yeah, they just wanted, they think cheap gas, That's what they want. So what do? They protest and they smash stuff. It says this is ongoing, but I can't see anything talking about yellow vest activity after 2020. So they, yeah. I think last but not least, I know recently there's been a lot of protests about like Macron or whatever. I don't really know anything about that, so I'm not going to talk about it. But last on this list, we've got the farmer protest. This is a big one. Come on, you guys know about this. The farmers protest, they just were protesting because they're losing subsidies on their farms. They weren't happy with trade agreements in the EU for their crops. So what did? They fucking went to Parliament and they sprayed a bunch of cow shit all over government buildings. They blocked roads with their tractors. I mean, don't mess with not mess with French people. Don't mess with French people with heavy machinery and cow shit. That's just common sense, if you ask me. I mean, just don't mess with French people, man. Tabernacle. We will be so angry. If you fuck with us, we will protest. The French are brutal, man. Barely even human. Animals. Violent animals. All of them. Sacre bleu. Man, I would love to visit France. Maybe not Paris. Paris seems kind of dirty, but I'd love to see the country. I'd love to be corrected. I'd love to say bonjour to someone and have them be like, that is not how you pronounce it. It is bonjour. You know what I mean? I'd love to go to France. Hopefully they don't be rude to me about my poor French skills. Je ne parle pas français. Très bien. Oh. Voulez-vous? I'll walk up to a French girl and say, voulez-vous mélanger toi avec moi et ton sœur? Oui? And then she smacked me. Anyway, yeah, don't mess with French people.